New York. Nowadays, they settled in a winter garden in the shadows of two emerald green magnolias twined round with Jamaican fern sprouts. "Let me introduce you to my friend," the woman pointed at a man who was sitting next to her. "This is Michel Noiri. He manages my assets." The man bowed his graying head with dignity. "That's it?" the young man asked, looking intently at him. A barely noticeable smile flitted across her face. "That's it," smoothing her hair, she responded with a tinge of sadness in her voice. The young man took a portable player out of his pocket, turned it on and asked his first question. "To begin with, Miss Smirnova, I have to ask you some standard questions." "How?" He became confused, not knowing how to put it. Seeing his confusion, the woman decided to help him out. "You must want to know how old I am. So, I don't keep it a secret. I'm turning 30 shortly. So, you can still call me by my name." Nadezhda, the young man repeated. "Are you married? Since magazines call me one of the richest single women in the world, this question seems unnecessary." The young man nodded. "Good answer. As far as I know, you have a French citizenship and reside in the French Riviera, although you are often spotted in London and here in New York. I like traveling, plus you have all means for that." "Yes," the woman confirmed. "I can afford it. I inherited my fortune from my ex-husband Vakhtang Gongadze 6 years ago. He was a very successful businessman in Russia." Hearing the last name, Gongadze, the young man got excited. "They say you're friends with his children, especially the elder one." "Alexander." After a moment's thinking, the woman responded, "Yes, we're good friends. They also say he has feelings for you." "Is that true?" The woman became confused. "Ask him. Did he propose to you?" the young man persisted. The woman lowered her eyes. "Okay, let's skip it." The young man looked at her meaningfully. "Alexander Gongadze is a very powerful man. He is a personal advisor of the President of Georgia. He is highly valued by the international financial community." "I know," the woman replied. "Back in the day, I was a co-founder of the bank which he now owns, and today I'm one of its shareholders." The young man became thoughtful. "Miss Smirnova, here's my last question." He readjusted the player on his lap. "You've always been far from the world of politics and business, and you, a famous socialite, were a favorite of fashion magazines. What brought you here?" The woman and the man exchanged glances, and the woman, trying to find the right words, said, "Although I've been living in France for many years and I'm a citizen of this country, I've always cared about my motherland, that is Russia. Now it's undergoing great changes and I really want to help it. I owe Russia a lot." Washington. 6 months ago. FBI Special Agent Michael Douglas has never been a dreamer. Young as he was, only 28 years old, he learned to take a sober view of things and, making an important decision, always rely on common sense rather than intuition or luck. Born in a family of modest means, he always solved his problems himself, without seeking help or advice from anybody. To enter Columbia University, he had to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps for 2 years and roast himself in Iraq and Afghanistan. He graduated from the Faculty of Law 3 years ago and was going to become a lawyer. However, when he had a chance to work for the FBI, he decided to go for it. Although working with the FBI was less rewarding financially and had fewer prospects than working for some private company, it was secure and predictable above all. While unfortunately he had to deal with all kinds of unexpected contingencies too many times in his life. Secondly, he always associated becoming an FBI agent with joining some inner circle of the government. He passed both a psychological test and a lie detector test, but when it came to his university study, the selection committee had doubts. Michael still could not understand why, among 24 candidates, the committee chose him. Perhaps it was because of his college boxing championship title and service in the Marine Corps, but nevertheless a week after he passed his entrance exams, he entered the FBI building in Quantico. He had to work hard there, too. He was a good shooter and physically fit, but had problems with criminalistics. That is why his placement in the FBI main office after graduation was a big surprise for him. Douglas parked his car on one of the streets adjacent to Pennsylvania Avenue and, passing by the former Ministry of Press building, headed to the FBI headquarters. He walked through a metal detector and showed his pass to a guard, crossed a well-deep inside yard with dozens of pictures of the FBI founding father J. Edgar Hoover, and walked up to the third floor. Hardly had he sat down in the chair when an in-house telephone rang. "Hello, Douglas speaking." He picked up the phone. "Hello, Michael," responded Douglas's department manager, a 40-year-old sturdy fellow and tireless womanizer, Robert Hoffman. "How are you doing?" "I'm good, sir. Thank you. I'm glad I found you." "Michael." Hoffman was speaking with someone on another phone. "There's work for you, so I'm waiting for you in my office. And bring 2 coffees from McDonald's, will you?" "I didn't have breakfast today." Douglas slipped on his blazer, locked the office door, grabbed 2 coffees, and walked up to the 5th floor the manager's offices were located on. Several agents from the same department as Douglas were waiting by Hoffman's door with papers to sign. "Oh, Michael, come on in." Hoffman's rosy-cheeked, tanned and somewhat equine face showed up in the doorway. He took Douglas by the hand and brought him to a table heaped up with newspapers and computer disks. "Have a seat." Hoffman opened up his coffee and took a few quick sips. Douglas sat down in the chair with a notebook on his lap to listen to what Hoffman had to say. Hoffman came to their department just a few months ago. He replaced the FBI veteran Eddie Stone, who had run the department for nearly 15 years and enjoyed indisputable authority with his employees. Stone was in his late 50s, so he was pensioned off his cushy job when the FBI leadership were asked to find a good job for a certain person. Douglas knew that Hoffman got the job thanks to his wife, who was friends with some bigwig from the Obama administration. "Listen, Michael, here's the thing. Yesterday, the director asked me to figure out something." Hoffman opened his safe and took out a heavy folder with some documents. He pulled out a few prints and handed them over to Douglas. "Our guys in Langley discovered another laundry of the Colombian drug cartel, and the names of a few well-known New York financiers popped up. The file has their names." Hoffman tapped on one of the prints with his finger. "Our boss asked us to look into one of them." Hoffman paused, trying to recall the name, but then read it out. "Alexander Gongadze. Do we have anything on him? Study who he spends time with. Maybe you'll find something interesting, although..." Hoffman waved his hand hopelessly. "I think it's a waste of time. The CIA's been investigating him for half a year now, but they've got nothing. Almost all New York financial heavyweights are mixed up in such criminal conspiracies. So don't waste too much time on him. Make up our conclusion. I'll read it and give it to the director. We've got other things to do. If you have no questions, you can go." Douglas returned to his office, put the folder in his safe, and rubbing the face with his hands, sat down at his computer. The work promised to be long and boring. His eyes kept on the ceiling. He tried to remember the password to access the FBI database. When he realized he could not do it, he started opening his desk drawers. When he finally found a travel brochure on Macau, which he happened to visit last year, and leafed through it, he found the required number and letter combination. It was written with a pen on the last page of the brochure. Douglas entered the database and looked through the files it had. to his request for Alexander Glangadze's immediate environment, several color photographs appeared on the screen. Douglas looked at him with interest. He saw a beautiful young woman. Damn it, she's gorgeous. He shook his head. Where did they meet them? Douglas thought. Recalling the face and body of his wife, he got a bis on fast food and coke. He read the captions under the photograph. So, Nadezhda Smirnova, the words sounded weird to Douglas. Born, studied, lived. He looked through her biography quickly, trying to remember as much of it as he could. As Douglas was winding up studying the files and was about to go have lunch, the telephone rang again. He picked it up and heard Hoffman's voice. "Mitchell, it's good you answered my call. I've got guys from Langley in my office. I'm sending 'em over to you." Short beeps followed. Damn. Douglas cursed involuntarily. Why now? He glanced at his watch. It was 2:30 p.m. If the meeting doesn't end quickly, I'll be left with no lunch, he thought, and taking off his blazer, sat back in his chair. A minute later, they knocked on the door. "Come in," Michael shouted unhappily. Two men entered the room. He knew one of them, Richard Brody from the European CIA. As for the other one, an elderly man whose face was all covered with scars, he saw him for the first time in his life. Albert Lisovsky, he introduced himself politely with a strong Slavic accent. When the agents sat down in chairs, Douglas switched on the air conditioner, put Hoffman's folder on the table, and looked at him intently, as if inviting him to engage in a conversation. His legs crossed, Richard Brody was relaxed, staring at the ceiling. He was pinching his reddish musketeer beard melancholically with his fingertips. The other one sat by the window, frozen in a position of high tension. He readjusted his large sunglasses. "Well, gentlemen, what can I do for you?" Douglas tried to sound confident, the way all detectives who have been with the FBI for a long time always do. "Here's the thing, Michael," Richard Brody began calmly, shifting his eyes from the ceiling to Douglas and making himself comfortable in his chair, exercising his rights as an older acquaintance of Douglas. He called Michael by his name. "Last year our investigation led us to an arms dealer, one of the Latinos, who was contacted by a well-known local financier. You must have come across his name in the file already. He's of Russian origin, now lives in France, but once in a while shows up here in New York." Brody paused, taking advantage of which Douglas asked, "Contacted how?" "Well," Brody waved his hand vaguely, "it doesn't matter. The bank he owned would give him loans on very favorable terms. It made us think something was off about it. So we contacted the French counterintelligence organization to have them check the guy, and they found out a very interesting fact. 3 years ago, his girlfriend Smirnova, also a Russian, was caught having a conspiracy meeting with a Russian embassy and France official. They've been keeping him under surveillance, and thus her name came up. They had a secret mail drop in the Bois de Boulogne. They deported the diplomat but didn't touch her. They pretended to believe the tales she told about some Russians who were trying to win her over to their side. She made a written statement in the police commissariat claiming that the embassy officials would pass her lists with some questions through the drop, and demanded that she collected secret information through her friends. They threatened her that if she refused to cooperate, her relatives in Russia would have serious problems. Did her friends have that information? Douglas wondered. Brody raised his eyebrows. Of course. They were well informed. 2 generals from the Ministry of Defense and 1 high-ranking official from the Chirac administration. Smirnova attended all social events in Paris and was always in the limelight. Such people were buzzing round her like bees round a honeypot. When those gentlemen learned who she was, they got scared and put pressure on the search, so they hushed the thing up. Besides, the newspapers found out about it somehow and made a big fuss. They wrote that a poor widow, who was still mourning, was being dragged by some cunning Russians who murdered her husband into some dirty business, and so on and so forth. So they didn't touch her. Besides, they wanted to wait until the scandal abates, she gets active, and they could find more members of the network through her. But she's been acting carefully since then. Didn't contact anybody and even moved to the US, got a green card. Although she still has her French citizenship. So, that's what Monsieur Lisowski told us in detail. Roddy nodded towards the man by the window. Douglas was listening to him with growing interest. We got the analysts on the case and they determined a weird regularity. This banker is somehow connected with most cases related to financial fraud. Not directly, indirectly. He's a friend of one person involved in the crime, a business partner with another. But the analytics claim it can't be a coincidence. Quote. Roddy fell silent, opened a bottle which was standing on the table, and poured some mineral water into a glass. Do you think he has anything to do with it? Douglas asked with suspicion. Roddy was about to reply when the man in sunglasses who was sitting by the window spoke in a rasping voice. No, I know Alexander Gangadze. He's not capable of it. The man stood up from his chair and, slightly limping, came up to the table. Who do you think is behind all this then? Roddy asked in confusion, taking a sip. Here she is. Quote. The man pulled a few pictures out of the folder and threw them on the table. Douglas saw the young woman whose face he was admiring on his computer screen an hour ago. Paris. 3 years ago. Nadezhda loved visiting Paris in fall. Yellow was her favorite color, and while wandering down the city streets and boulevards, strewn with fallen leaves, it seemed to her that the time had turned back and she was a little girl again, playing in the leaves with some childish joy. Among all the cities she has visited, Paris has been her favorite. She enjoyed its unhurried and measured rhythm. It was nothing like London's primness or the bustling haste of New York City. She felt at home in Paris. It seemed to her that she had been born here and Paris was her hometown. Like to any Parisian, the austere lines of the Elysian fields and fanciful patterns of the Eiffel Tower were close to her. Paris gave her strength, made her think, dream and make plans for the future. Its streets and boulevards attracted her. She liked strolling around the city late at night, when she could take her time viewing any shop window or billboard in front of a store or a cabaret. Each time she was in Paris, she would visit the Louvre or Versailles to enjoy undying masterpieces created by the world's best painters, and walked for hours among the vernissages and exhibitions of Rue de Verneuil, learning modern art tendencies. Paris was her secret lifelong love. Admiring its majestic beauty, union of ancient antiquity and modernism, at heart she considered it the best city on earth, undeclared world capital, modern cultural mecca. She had a tight schedule that day, to break away from a whirlpool of obligations and take a stroll around the city at least for an hour. She had to cancel her lunch with the Givenchy creative director, which they had been planning to have for quite a while, having asked her assistant, a prompt 18-year-old Dutch girl with a lovelock of flaxen hair, to postpone the meeting till later. Nadezhda came out of Burgundy Hotel, caught a taxi and made comfortable herself in the back seat. The hotel was conveniently located close to both the Elysian fields, where Nadezhda rented an office and had to go to quite often, and metro stations, which allowed her to leave Burgundy when needed without being seen. She hopped off the taxi at Mayo Boulevard, passed through the gates of the Bois de Boulogne and went deep into its wide shady alleys. In spite of the warm sunny weather, it was gloomy and cool under the crowns of century-old oak trees. A few squirrels were playing among the twigs covered with withered leaves, their fluffy tails spread. Birds' continuous twitter could be heard in the air. Nadezhda glanced at her watch, walked round a horse track and stopped by a small duckweed-covered lake. She noticed a bench twined round with ivy sprouts, came up to it, sat down on its side and pulled a Le Monde newspaper out of her purse. Flowing off granite boulders, the waterfall's transparent streams were falling down into the water by her feet. Its noise was almost never heard from here and bothered only dragonflies and butterflies sitting on the grass. Nadezhda unfolded the newspaper and with her left hand started feeling about the upper part of the bench stump carefully. She found a small rock in a hollow, covering it with the newspaper. Hid it inside the purse lying on her laps. Nadezhda lingered for a short while, got up and quickly headed towards the exit. She came out to Boulevard Suchet, got into a taxi and in 10 minutes entered the vestibule of her hotel. She found out from her assistant that nobody had called her, picked up her laptop off the table, locked herself up in the bathroom, and switched the laptop on. She separated the rock in 2 parts and inserted one of them into the USB port. Once an automatic decoder started, the screen began showing the message line by line. She has been working in France for 3 years. Her life after Gongadz's death was full of events. She traveled around Europe a lot and only once spent 6 straight months living in a vacation home near Moscow where people who looked and behaved like Fedorov were teaching her what he started to teach her 5 years ago in Nice. Finding herself in this world, which was nothing like the world of regular people, she had to obey its laws, strict and implacable, and commit her whole life to what the fate had assigned to her. While lying in her bed, she was thinking over her plans for the next day. She made all the calls she had to make earlier that evening, and was faced with the question she received in that message. She had to make a decision whether she wanted to go underground and go back to Moscow or, if possible, move to another country and continue her work there. She was still under surveillance and, given all the circumstances, like the fact that it was difficult to ensure her safety even in case of her moving to another country, the center inclined to the first option. Nevertheless, the final decision was hers. A messenger, whom she had to tell her decision, was to be waiting for her in Café Montmartre the next day. The cipher message contained no password, but said she knew the messenger personally. Waking up early in the morning, Nadezhda still did not know what to do. Her escape to Moscow would create a media scandal and endanger all the people she was connected with, not only in her shadow, secret life but also her ordinary life. Moving to another country was not a universal solution either. Besides, there was no guarantee that the omnipresent reporters would not find her there. Ever since she inherited Gongadz's fortune and got on the cover of Forbes magazine as one of the world's wealthiest women, the media has never taken their eyes off her. If the CERT found out about her secret meetings with the Russian diplomats, she had to think up a plausible explanation. Perhaps she had to sacrifice somebody from the embassy, accusing him of an attempt to recruit her as an informant. The newspapers will make a fuss over it and she would be able to get out of it with clear hands. Nadezhda has been thinking over this plan for a long time. Moscow knew about it, so only least valuable residentiura agents contacted her. She could not be sure they would believe her story, yet it could draw attention away from her at least for a while. At 1 p.m., she was strolling near the stated café in Montmartre. Given the surveillance she was subjected to, she could not contact the messenger directly but had to communicate her decision with a signal. So the messenger had to be a person close to her, someone who knew her well. Who can it be? Nadezhda was thinking, passing round a row of colorful tables standing on the sidewalk. When the clock on the medieval cathedral chimed 13 times, the front door of the building across the street opened and a broad-shouldered man in a dark blue suit came out. Nadezhda fixed her eyes on him involuntarily. There was something familiar about him and the way he walked. Suddenly, she stopped and grew pale, with a smile at the corners of his mouth. Fedorov was approaching her. It was their third meeting during the past 3 years. They talked a couple of times during her stay in that vacation home near Moscow. But it was the first time they met after she returned to France. Hesitating, Nadezhda took her first step and, putting her sunglasses on, walked to meet Fedorov. According to the cipher message, this meant moving to another country. They passed each other without saying a word. Fedorov readjusted a cuff on his sleeve, meaning the signal had been received. Got into a car which was parked near the sidewalk, drove to the middle of the street and turned into a nearest alley. Exhausted, Nadezhda sat down at a side table of the cafe. When her breathing became even and pulse steady, she pulled a cell phone out of her purse. She called the police commissariat and uttered in an injured and slightly uncertain voice, "Bonjour. Monsieur, Madame Smirnova speaking." "Yes, it's me," she confirmed, upon hearing the reply. "I have very important information to share." Washington. 6 months ago, Michael took the picture of the woman and walked around his office. "That's a serious accusation," he said after a long delay. "Monsieur Lisovsky, you need good reasons to say this. People change. Nothing spoils a man like money and power." "Maybe," Lisovsky uttered philosophically. "I can assume that Gongadze might have changed. Perhaps I didn't know him well enough. But I know this woman and I'm sure that she'll never change. Once a wolf, always a wolf." Brody and Douglas looked at each other in perplexity, and the latter asked Lisovsky, "What do you mean?" "I mean that Smirnova has always been our enemy and she still is." Douglas shrugged his shoulders. "But she's rich and lives a life many people can only dream of. Including us." He grinned. "For all I know, money's not her goal. That's what attracted late Gongadze to her and what later killed him, when she had to choose between gold and love." Brody raised his head with interest. Yes, I heard something about it." "Can you remind me?" he asked Lisovsky. He wrinkled his nose in discontent. "Let's do it another time." To win the enemy, it's important to know his weak spots, Brody noted. "But why do you think she's such a monster? She's only 30 years old. In fact, she doesn't know life and can't do much. How can she manage such events?" Lisovsky smirked. "She doesn't have to. For her, what she can do better than anybody else is already enough control people, especially men. I'm sure she can twist Gongadze Jr. around her little finger. He's a talented financier. She only has to point out the ultimate goal, while Gongadze will figure out how to achieve it." "I've been following their story closely and it resembles the situation with Gongadze Sr. The only difference is that in the first case Smirnova used her charm to take his money away. But now she uses his son, playing some game in the world financial markets. In my opinion, a very dangerous one. We still don't know why the crisis broke out back in 2007. Whoa, slow down. Douglas waved his hand. Crisis is a natural phenomenon. Lisovsky smirked skeptically. A slight push is enough to shake the world's economy loose. And then it will start collapsing like a house of cards. Unstoppable. Silence covered the office. But it takes a lot of money, the enormous money, Brody noted, shrugging his shoulders. I don't think Alexander Gongadze has it. Lisovsky readjusted the glasses on his nose. Most likely, Gongadze doesn't have it, he agreed. But other people do. Who? Douglas asked in amazement. Russia is not a very rich country right now. Its budget's nothing as compared with that of the USA. That's not what I mean. Lisowski paused and, taking out a pack of cigarettes, gave Douglas an inquiring look. When he nodded to express his consent, he lit a cigarette, came up to the open window and let out a thin spiral of smoke. I mean something else, he repeated. What is it? Douglas asked. I mean the PARTYGOLD. Lisowski said quietly but confidently. Everybody fell silent for a moment, after which Douglas and Brody exchanged glances, smiling. Monsieur Lisowski, don't you know that there's no party gold? It's nothing but a myth. If it did exist, it was split by former party members a long time ago. They know how to do it better than building communism. Lisowski shook his head. Maybe it is a myth. But in 1991, while working for the KGB, I learned that they started liquidating the people who were somehow connected with the under-the-table activity of the financial and economic departments of the Central Committee long before the August coup failed. By the way, I took advantage of it and averted suspicion of treason because your legendary Ames gave me away too, disclosing which department of the first chief directorate I worked for. Upon hearing the name of Ames, a former high-ranking CIA agent who had been feeding confidential information to the Soviet and then Russian intelligence service for many years, Brody's face became distorted like with toothache. Enough, Monsieur Lisowski. Don't bring up that name. America will need a lot of time to recover from the blow he delivered. Lisowski grinned. Okay, I won't. Ames didn't know my name because I worked not with the CIA but with the French Special Services, and that's what saved me, as well as the fact that, given the fate that suffered my so-called colleagues, a covering operation was carried out. We videotaped a resident of the French military intelligence throwing a bundle into the moving car of one of the employees from my department. All it had was just some microfilms and anti-Soviet literature. She failed to notice it and report, but when she did, it was too late. The directorate leadership had already watched it. Brody lifted his thumb. Good job. And now imagine that the gold was actually transported overseas and is stored somewhere, Lisowski continued. Its price may have skyrocketed. And unlike Russia, the Soviet Union was a rich country. And you think that now, after 20 years, there's a chance to find it? Brody wondered. We don't have to try to find it, Lisowski said quietly, as if to himself. I believe there are people who are looking for it, or who may have already found it. We should only keep a close eye on Mr. Gongadze and Madame Smirnova. If they're involved in it, sooner or later their actions will betray that they have the gold, and this is when we will walk out on the stage. And before that, we shouldn't interfere and should let them do what they have to do. Quote,